Everyone talks about the empath's curse, the overwhelming floods of other people's emotions, the exhaustion, the constant giving until there's nothing left. You've probably been told you're too sensitive, too emotional, that you read too much into things. But what if your sensitivity isn't a burden you have to manage? What if it's the most powerful psychological tool that exists, and you've just been using it wrong? Picture this: you walk into a meeting and instantly know who's threatened, who's hiding something, who's about to explode. 6 months ago, you'd absorb all the tension and leave with a migraine. But what if instead, you could read that room like sheet music, and conduct the emotional orchestra? That's exactly what happened to Sarah. In one boardroom moment, she looked at 2 executives locked in what seemed like a budget dispute and said quietly, "This isn't about money." Jonathan feels his expertise is being questioned, and Maria's frustrated her ideas weren't heard. Both executives went silent, not because she'd been confrontational, but because she'd been surgically accurate. Within minutes, the real issues were on the table, and a meeting that had been circling dysfunction for an hour became productive. This is the story of what happens when empaths stop being victims of the gifts and start becoming their masters. And what you discover might completely change how you see your own sensitivity forever. Act 1. The psychological GPS you didn't know you had. Sarah's transformation didn't happen overnight. 8 months after her empathic awakening, that moment when she stopped absorbing Marcus's projections and started seeing clearly, she began noticing something unexpected. Her sensitivity hadn't decreased. If anything, it had become more precise. Walking into her new office for the first time, Sarah could instantly map the emotional landscape. The receptionist's genuine warmth versus the forced smile. The tension between 2 departments that nobody had explicitly mentioned. The senior partner's carefully hidden anxiety about the upcoming presentation. But here's what was different: instead of drowning in this information, Sarah found herself using it strategically. When she approached the anxious partner with a simple, "Is there anything you'd like me to review before the presentation?" she wasn't just being helpful, she was reading his emotional needs and responding with exactly what would be most useful. Jung observed this phenomenon in his most psychologically gifted patients. What society calls oversensitivity is actually advanced emotional intelligence operating without conscious direction. Think about it: empaths notice micro-expressions others miss, sense authenticity instantly, and can predict relationship dynamics with startling accuracy. The problem was never the ability. The problem was that empaths had been gaslit into believing their perceptions were wrong, so they used their psychological GPS to second-guess themselves instead of navigate more effectively. Sarah realized she'd been carrying a sophisticated emotional radar system her entire life and treating it like a burden instead of the strategic advantage it actually was. Right, I have emotional radar. If you've ever sensed exactly what someone needed before they even asked, or predicted a relationship problem months before it surfaced. Act 2. The 3 tests of mastery. Test 1. The office predator. Sarah's first real test came 2 weeks into her new job. During a team meeting, she watched David, the sales director, systematically undermining a junior colleague named Lisa. His technique was subtle, questioning her data just enough to plant doubt, making jokes that seemed harmless but left Lisa looking smaller each time. The old Sarah would have absorbed Lisa's humiliation and David's hidden aggression, probably going home with a stress headache and feeling vaguely responsible for fixing the dynamic. But conscious Sarah saw the pattern with clinical clarity. David felt threatened by Lisa's innovative ideas and was using social manipulation to maintain his position. Sarah had a choice. She could use her insight to expose David publicly. She knew exactly which questions would reveal his insecurity and make him look foolish. Or she could use her emotional intelligence more strategically. After the meeting, Sarah approached Lisa privately. "Your proposal was solid," she said simply. "Don't let the questioning make you doubt your research. Some people ask questions not because they're curious, but because they're uncomfortable with ideas they didn't think of first." To David, she was equally direct but different in approach. "I've been in situations where new team members brought fresh perspectives that initially felt threatening," she mentioned during a casual conversation. "It's interesting how the best leaders find ways to mentor that innovation instead of questioning it." Within weeks, David's behavior shifted. Not because Sarah had confronted him, but because she'd addressed his underlying fear while simultaneously empowering Lisa. Sarah had learned to use her empathic insights like a surgeon's scalpel: precise, intentional, healing-focused. Test 2. The family trigger. The second test arrived during Sarah's first holiday gathering since leaving Marcus. Sitting at her parents' dinner table, she could feel the familiar patterns trying to reassert themselves. Her mother's anxiety about the meal being perfect. Her father's subtle criticism disguised as humor. Her brother's passive-aggressive comments about her sudden life changes. The old Sarah would have spent the evening managing everyone's emotions, reassuring her mother, deflecting her father's barbs, trying to keep peace between family members who used her as an emotional buffer. But conscious Sarah made a different choice. When her mother started apologizing for the slightly overcooked turkey, Sarah simply said, "Mom, this is delicious. Thank you for all the work you put into making this special." No absorption of anxiety, no excessive reassurance, just genuine appreciation. When her father made a snide comment about people who suddenly think they're too good for their families, Sarah looked directly at him and said calmly, "I don't think I'm too good for anyone, Dad. I just think I'm good enough to have healthy boundaries." The room fell silent, but not with tension, with a kind of startled respect. Sarah had refused to play her old role without creating drama or defensiveness. She'd simply been clear and calm. By the end of the evening, something remarkable had happened. Without Sarah absorbing everyone's emotional static, the family members had started actually talking to each other instead of talking through her. Her refusal to be the emotional mediator had forced everyone to develop their own communication skills. Test 3. The Helper's Trap. Sarah's third test was the most subtle and potentially the most dangerous. 3 months into her new job, colleagues started coming to her with their problems. They'd seek her out for advice about difficult clients, workplace conflicts, even personal relationship issues. At first, Sarah felt flattered. Her insights were genuinely helpful, and people seemed to value her perspective. But then she started noticing a pattern. People weren't just coming to her for advice, they were coming to her instead of handling their own challenges. She realized she was in danger of recreating her old empath pattern on a professional level. Instead of being everyone's emotional processing center in her personal life, she was becoming everyone's psychological consultant at work. The temptation was real. Sarah's insights were accurate, her advice was effective, and helping others felt meaningful. But Jung had warned about this exact trap. When empaths discover the gifts, they can become addicted to being needed for their perception rather than valued for their whole self. Sarah made a conscious choice. When colleagues came to her with problems, she started asking questions instead of providing solutions. "What do you think might be driving his behavior?" she'd ask, or "How do you feel when that happens?" She became a mirror that reflected people back to their own wisdom instead of a crutch that prevented them from developing their own emotional intelligence. This wasn't coldness, it was conscious empathy. Sarah was using her gifts to empower others rather than enable dependency. Act 3. The Science of Empathic Evolution. Research on highly sensitive individuals suggests these people don't just feel more intensely, they appear to process emotional information more thoroughly, taking longer to evaluate subtle social cues before responding. Think of it like having a high-definition emotional camera while most people operate with standard resolution. The detail is extraordinary, but without proper settings, you get overwhelmed by visual noise instead of crystal-clear images. Some neuroscience studies indicate that with conscious practice, empaths may maintain their enhanced perception while developing better emotional regulation. Brain imaging research suggests increased connectivity between feeling centers and decision-making regions, like building a better highway between your heart and your head. Sarah's responses had fundamentally shifted. She still received the same vivid emotional signals from others, but now she could pause, evaluate, and choose her response rather than automatically absorbing and reacting. This aligns with what Jung described as integrating the feeling function. Instead of being flooded by emotional data, conscious empaths learn to use it strategically, like emotional detectives who gather all the evidence before drawing conclusions. The key insight: you don't lose your sensitivity through mastery. You gain precision. Act 4. The Mastery Moment. Sarah's defining moment came 6 months after her integration began. She was in a client meeting when she noticed something troubling. Her client, a successful entrepreneur, was showing signs of what Sarah recognized as severe burnout masked by manic productivity. The old Sarah might have absorbed his manic energy and left feeling agitated without understanding why. The newly awakened Sarah might have felt compelled to diagnose his condition and offer unwanted psychological insights. But conscious Sarah made a different choice. During a natural pause in their business discussion, she simply said, "You seem like someone who gives everything to your work. I hope you're taking care of yourself too." It was a gentle observation, not a diagnosis. An expression of care, not an intervention. But it landed with perfect timing because Sarah had read not just what he needed to hear, but when he was ready to hear it. The entrepreneur paused, his manic energy shifting to something more vulnerable. "Actually," he said quietly, "I haven't taken a real break in 2 years. I keep thinking if I just push through this next project, I'll be able to relax. But there's always another project." Sarah didn't offer solutions or launch into therapeutic mode. She simply listened with the quality of attention that made it safe for him to acknowledge what he'd been avoiding. By the end of the conversation, he was talking about taking his first vacation in years, not because Sarah had convinced him, but because her conscious empathy had created space for his own wisdom to emerge. This is empathic mastery, using your extraordinary perceptual abilities to offer exactly what's needed in each moment, nothing more, nothing less. Not drowning in others' emotions, not fixing everyone's problems, but creating conditions for genuine connection and growth. Act 5, the choice that defines everything. Jung observed that empaths who successfully integrate the gifts face a crucial ethical choice. Will you use these abilities to heal or to manipulate? Will you become a servant of growth or a master of control? Sarah faced this choice every day. In board meetings where she could read everyone's insecurities and use them to get her way. In family gatherings where she could guilt people into compliance with surgical precision. In friendships where she could maintain the upper hand by always knowing exactly what others were feeling before they did. The power was intoxicating. Sarah realized she could probably manipulate almost any situation to her advantage using her emotional intelligence. She could be the puppet master of every social dynamic, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else's emotional reactions. But Sarah also realized this was the shadow side of empathic mastery, the temptation to use extraordinary perception for personal advantage rather than collective healing. The conscious choice was clear. Mastery meant restraint as much as skill. It meant using her gifts to empower others rather than control them, to heal rather than harm, to create authentic connection rather than strategic advantage. Every day, Sarah chose healing. Not because she was naturally good, but because she understood that true mastery of any powerful ability requires wisdom about when not to use it. Comment: I choose mastery, if you've reached the point where you can feel everything clearly but choose your responses wisely. Jung's most profound insight about empaths wasn't that they need to become less sensitive, it was that they need to become consciously sensitive. And when they do, they don't just transform their own lives. They become agents of transformation for everyone around them. Sarah's story reveals something extraordinary. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. When properly integrated, it becomes your wisdom, your strength, and your gift to a world desperately in need of emotional intelligence. The empath who masters the gifts doesn't become cold or manipulative. They become precisely empathetic, feeling deeply while choosing wisely, seeing clearly while responding with perfect timing, offering exactly what's needed without losing themselves in others' emotional chaos. But this mastery comes with responsibility. The more clearly you can see, the more carefully you must choose how to use that sight. The more deeply you can feel, the more consciously you must decide where to direct that feeling. The more accurately you can read others, the more ethically you must apply those insights. Your empathic abilities aren't just personal gifts, they're tools for healing a world that's forgotten how to feel authentically, connect genuinely, and communicate with emotional honesty. The question isn't whether you're too sensitive. The question is whether you're ready to stop being a victim of your gifts and start being their master. Because the world doesn't need fewer sensitive people, it needs more conscious ones. Your sensitivity is your superpower. The only question remaining is, are you ready to learn how to use it? Comment: I am ready for mastery, if you're prepared to transform unconscious absorption into conscious choice, emotional overwhelm into strategic empathy, and sensitivity into strength. Because your journey from victim to master starts with recognizing that you were never broken. You were just operating extraordinary equipment without an instruction manual. Now you have the manual. The question is, what will you do with your power?